One of our dearest clients wrote in an email, "The sense of being / having enough has been really resonating with me lately, feeling like there isn't enough of me as a mama, wife, daughter, sister, friend, employee, community member. Not enough time, not enough for all the needs. It feels like a scarcity mindset that's difficult to break out of." Sociologist Caitlin Collins interviewed 135 working women, mothers also, from Sweden, Germany, Italy, and the United States. Guess which women were the most stressed and often broke down crying in the interviews? Sweden? Italy? No, the US. Collins pointed out American moms stood apart not only for their stress and their worry, but they were the only women that interviewed who didn't expect to have external support. It was the American moms uniquely who blamed themselves for their own stress and thought it was their own job to resolve it. Welcome to The Behaviorist with Work Wisdom, where we help you adopt high-performance mindsets, behaviors, communication, and culture. I'm your host, Sarah Colantonio. Our intention for the Behaviorist podcast is to share accessible, concrete practices that you can weave into your whole life to begin a shift toward joy and meaningful achievement. Today, we're turning our focus on mom guilt, and we're grateful to have Ashlyn Maslin-Serrani, Donor Services Officer from Lancaster County Community Foundation, Vanessa Filbert, CEO at Community Action Partnership and Associate of Work Wisdom, also Dr. Carmela Truss, psychologist at the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs, and an associate of Work Wisdom, joining us.
Hey.
Thank you all for sharing your wisdom today. So here we are, you're all leaders and mothers, and we are taking it on ourselves to solve this, aren't we?
No pressure.
No.
I'm not a mother, I'm a stepmom, so I'm really interested to learn about this concept. So Ashlyn, I want to start with you. What does it mean to have mom guilt? Like, this is a working mom phenomenon, correct? We're not grappling with dad guilt, are we? Like, is your husband a working father?
I like to say career mom or career parent, because I think no matter if you're a mom, a dad, a parent, a caregiver, you're working, right? But having a career and being a parent is this special kind of challenge and balance. So my husband is a career dad. He's a software engineer. And I have been working full-time since, before I got pregnant, but since we had our first daughter. So it seems like it's something that's unique to people who identify as moms in the conversations I've had. I think dad guilt is out there, but I don't see dads discuss it as much. Maybe I'm just not in these conversations, but this is I'd love to hear what you all think.
I would say the question is it about like emotional literacy and people being willing to kind of own those vulnerable feelings that they have? Because so much of mom guilt is about these struggles with feeling like something isn't enough or, like something isn't being achieved the way that somebody thinks it should be. So is it that there's no such thing as dad or non-binary or other types of parenting guilt? Or is it that maybe mothers are starting the conversations? I'd wonder.
I mean, I think it's interesting. What is mom guilt? I feel like it's an evolution of an understanding of the beginning and ends of ourselves. I feel like where I've struggled the most is when I thought, there's a finite amount of who I am that I can contribute to the world, and I'm trying to meet everyone's needs around whatever those needs are, and that contributes to like feeling like someone's not getting the best of me or the most of me in a moment. And I do think that's something that probably translates beyond moms and dads to people who are just caring for others and managing a lot of things. But I don't want to take away just the importance of the language, to your point, Carm, that we're giving by saying mom guilt is a real thing. And something that women are using language to express in a way that maybe they didn't do 50 years ago.
I love your definition because, spoiler alert, that email was me that Sarah read at the beginning. But that sense of, what did you say, like giving the best of yourself in all situations and not always being able to, right? Like everybody has a limit, but then who gets the best that day? Does your work get the best? Do your kids get the best?
Do the dishes get the best?
And I think that's a really interesting mentality, because when we think about giving the best of ourselves, you know, colloquially, there's always this like, I gave 110%, which one is not real, right? You cannot give more than entirely of yourself. But we can start to ask this question of, where did I learn that doing well at something, doing something meaningfully, means that I give the entirety of myself? Because the math of that requires like all of us be 5 of us, right? Like the self that's fully caring for me, the self that's fully caring for my kids, the self that's fully caring for my friends and partners. And next thing you know, like, talk about tapping into scarcity, right? Like, we don't have the time or the energy to be able to do that. And so our expectations versus what's possible are so discrepant that we're set up. And I think that's the setup for guilt, right? Is that this mismatch, right? But
and
I'm sure we'll talk about that.
That is so defeating, right? Like, even if you can't articulate, my expectations are here, and what is actually possible is much lower, because the expectations are here. It kind of feels like you're constantly losing, or you're constantly not doing enough, right? Yeah.
Well, I think part of that is, I think it's all about the story that we tell ourselves. So is there a story where it's, I have to give my entire self to this thing, this person, this assignment, or can I discern what is the best version of me in the present moment that I'm in with whoever's in front of me? And I think that takes a lot more intentionality and clarity about what you being your best looks like.
Right.
And that's different for all of us. You know, maybe my best self is when I can always bring humor in a space that I'm in. And when I know, when I'm not contributing that, it's a signal like, oh, I'm not feeling so great because I can't even find the joy or the humor, whether it's with my kids and we know that as moms, right? So like there's things that your kids do, and on a certain day it's super funny, and on the next day it's like, you might not be here.
Absolutely not.
Don't do it. So I think that it's giving us margin to assess that best version and showing up in that space.
And honestly, I think a lot of that is about being present and operating from the present moment, tuning in with what we care about and what matters to us in that moment, because each new context is gonna, I think, like you're pointing out, Vanessa, is gonna have a different balance where we're bringing different things to this moment at this time in this context. And so oftentimes when guilt is showing up in our bodies and our minds, we're not really operating from this moment looking in the eyes of the person across the room from us, right? It's like we're up in our heads in the story, you know, feeling like we can't do the thing the story is telling us we're supposed to be doing.
Wow. Yeah. And I think that idea of being intentional and having that sort of mindfulness, I'm just thinking that so much of parenting, unless you stop and take a breath, and so much even of being at work, it just feels like you're reactive, right?
Oh, yeah.
What you read about moms specifically in the U.S. being just in this like incredibly stressful mindset and feeling like you need to resolve it on your own. Like, how do you even find space to be intentional and mindful and reflect on what your best self is when it feels like you're drowning? What do you do?
Right.
Yeah. I don't know. Sarah, this is your podcast. So
Answer questions.
Do you have a question, or do you want us to just keep on riffing here a little bit?
What I was interested in is where does it come from? I was going to start with you, Carm. What sets this off? What's the igniter?
Of where guilt comes from? Yeah. So I think, not to get to dipping into theory here for a second, but, you know, when we are learning and developing language skills, there's automatically from, you know, infancy, childhood, as we start to put words to our experiences, we start to build stories and we relate things to other things, right? It's really important for us to be able to know, like, danger is safe, right? But bigger, smaller, poisonous, safe to eat, right? There's all these comparative frames around time and space and all this that are really important for us to be able to comprehend, to be able to navigate the world. But what starts to happen as complex language starts to develop and all of these like psych nerd theory stuffs, acceptance and commitment therapy, relational frame theory, is that we start to apply these things to more than just contexts where it's helpful. We start to apply it to ourselves versus other people. So now, an innocuous example is like foods that are safe and good to eat. Good meaning not kill you, and foods that are harmful to eat. But good and bad, when we start saying good parent, bad parent, right? Good kid, bad kid, starts to be wildly unhelpful, right? But a lot of times what happens from that guilt perspective that I think you're talking about is something cues it. The emotion shows up, it shows up in our bodies, and then we're entirely immersed in the story, and we're not taking a step back to go, oh, look, a story has showed up. I wonder what I want to do with that. And I think it speaks to the statistic you quoted, Sarah, because if we can step back from the story and go, well, do I think that's something I want to buy into? Where do I think I got that from? Who benefits from me buying into this story? And if I don't want to live my life in alignment with that story right now, then maybe I can interact with it differently. I can let it be background noise. I can align my behaviors in another direction. But instead, a lot of times what we do is we try to do this quick reconciliation because it's discrepancy, right? And we don't like cognitive dissonance and uncertainty and all of those uncomfortable feelings. So it's a lot more controllable to be like, this is probably my fault. So why don't I just, because we can control our own behavior, right? And we know that. So our mind almost creates this narrative that if we take more control over it, it could somehow become manageable. But that sets us up in this wild cycle, right? Where now we're trying to control all this stuff. And you're just nodding your head, Vanessa.
Yeah.
So
I mean, I think it's, for me, it's comparison is a thief of joy.
Right.
And how can I find joy in the things that, I've been assigned to do in this world if I'm constantly comparing myself to whatever I think someone else who's doing it better, whatever that means. So I think there's this place about, and this has been my experience, is that oftentimes when we are struggling with comparison and we have an internal narrative, we're looking for evidence and we will find it. So if I want evidence that I'm not a good mom today, I'll think about the interaction with my kid where I was short. If I want to find evidence about how I wasn't a good leader today, I'll reflect on a part of a meeting that maybe didn't go the way that I wanted it to go. So this training of ourselves of saying, okay, I've got to recalibrate what I'm looking for evidence for.
Right. And that's confirmation bias, what you're
100%.
talking about. But I think we also aren't necessarily trained as people to think like all information is interpreted.
Oh,
so
right.
anything I encounter, I have to make sense of. And so I can frame that through the lens of, wow, look at this great thing I did. Or I can frame the very same piece of data through, wow, that wasn't perfect. What a F up.
Right.
And it can literally be the same exact thing.
Yeah.
And so not taking that step back from our thoughts and experiences and noticing some of this can set us up.
Yeah.
Yeah, Ashlyn, I was thinking, now that you outed yourself with
Yes.
it, I wanted to say too, you had mentioned about social media. And when I was saying, how does, what sets it off, that sort of came to mind when, it's such an easy place to compare.
Oh my goodness. Yeah. When you see a picture of a really happy family that's one of your friends and you love them so much and they're baking something and all their kids are wearing matching clothes or even clothes that just don't have stains on them and they're like all looking at the camera and smiling and it's like, oh my gosh, if I took a picture of my house right now and you know in your head like that is not completely real.
Well, it took them 100 takes.
Right,
to get that
because if
picture.
the children are looking at the camera, like it took, 100 takes. But that comparison creeps in. I think it's not just social media. Social media is definitely, even like the ads that are marketed at parents.
Right.
All these like beautiful, so that can kind of get in there.
I think that's huge because these triggers, like ads, social media, these things that set up really interesting stories, right? Like, you should live in a house that never looks or feels lived in. Right?
Not possible.
It's literally impossible. Yeah. But, that's where asking the question, like, who benefits from me buying into this story is a really interesting one, because I think a lot of mom guilt is related to things that are actually meant to sell products. So things like, oh, wow, you just had a baby. You should look like you never had a baby. So here are the, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of products that you should buy, right?
Accurate.
So it's really interesting to think, like, whether it's the home, the kids' outfits, the activities, like the things the mom is supposed to look like or do or be. A lot of that, if it's triggering that guilt, we should ask if somebody's trying to make a buck off it, because a lot of times they are.
Yeah. It's successful.
Yeah.
So this is really interesting. I was talking about that sociologist earlier, and in Sweden, like, there's this joke that when Americans get off the plane, they're like, why do Swedes hire so many men to be nannies? And the joke is they're fathers. So Vanessa, I wanted to start with you. What does balance look like? Is it about fair expectations between both parents, like figuring out what that is? What are we talking about here?
I mean, I think balance starts with self, right?
Yeah.
So before I can require my partner to help me find balance, I've got to create some internal balance. And I think for me, the way I try to do that is being kind, being curious, being honest, and setting good boundaries, which is not easy for me to do because I'm a 2 on the Enneagram. So I am wired to like overextend myself every single time.
Boundaries are hard.
And they are hard. And I think what makes it difficult for those of us who are in the world feeling like our purpose in the world is to help, it becomes really hard because then it doesn't feel like I'm fulfilling my purpose if I'm not helping everyone all the time. So I think there's a place there, but it's also like invitation. So I've got to invite, my partner in and my kids in to like, this is a story that I'm telling myself about this. Give me other data points about the story. Okay. Because sometimes I think we have guilt, and when we talk to our kids or our partner, they're not even thinking about the things that we're thinking about. The data points aren't as impactful as we think they are, and vice versa. There are some things that really like are big things for them that we think are the things that we can like, trim the fat around. And if we're intentional about communication and this idea of like we're all committed to each other and we care about each other, I think we can create more balance. But oftentimes I think we're pursuing balance with getting no information from anybody else who's a part of the equation. So I think finding balance for me has been, I remember when I decided to go back to college as a working adult. I was 31 or something. So my kids were, 10, 5, and 4, like young kids. And my husband and I, we have different things that we bring to our family. I do most of the cooking. He does mostly all the other things, which we are grateful for. But it was a small thing of saying, we had a family meeting with small kids saying, Mom really wants to do this thing. It's really important to her, and it's important for you guys long term. But this is what it means for our family. It means she won't be home these nights. It means she needs time to study. It means that Dad's going to learn how to do some cooking, and you're going to have to be gracious with him about that. It's about learning and building culture around helping each other. And it was just that moment of like, we rocked that schedule for 5 years.
Wow.
But I remember when I graduated, those 4 faces were the most important faces in the audience, and they were beaming. They were so proud because I invited them in. I didn't say, I'm going to go back to school. I'm going to figure it out. Nothing has to change here. And I think that's part of bringing balance. It's kind, it's curious, and it's honest, but it's an invitation.
That's
Love
amazing.
that. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't always do it right, but in my mind, in reflection,
Yeah.
I should.
I'm just kind of stunned because I'm thinking that I feel like the typical way would be what you said you didn't do, which is I'm going to try to make this as smooth as possible for my family.
For
I'm going to
everybody,
handle
right.
all the things. And
No one
then
has
maybe,
to feel, and no one has to make any adjustments.
right,
Just
or
me.
feel inconvenience and then maybe implode because
Yeah.
how
Or
is that
fail, or
possible?
fail, or drop out of school.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
love that.
Yeah. I think that's really key what you're pointing out with that too, because I think somehow along the way I've encountered a lot of people in my own life included that have these ideas or will kind of verbalize things around like, I shouldn't change as a person, so I'm somehow like hurting or violating my relationships if I change as a person, if my needs change, if the things I want to do change, and then other people have to adjust in accordance with that. And it's really interesting to step back from that, because that I certainly had internalized that. And stepping back from that and thinking, wait, what's the implication of being the same exact person I was as a young adult, let's even say 25 and be gracious there, as I am in my 40s, 50s, 60s, if I'm able to live that long, right? So like, it's really interesting to think that we would do so much to try to maintain not, and we tell ourselves these stories, right, that we're hurting other people, imposing on other people because we'd be asking for adjustment, flexibility, partnership, change. And I think that's a big part of when moms are transitioning in jobs, transitioning schedules. It's like, I'm asking for change. And that implies that it's such a bad, terrible thing. When it's like, do we really want to not change, not grow, not push ourselves, not try new things our whole lives? Like, is that something we'll be satisfied with?
Right. And I think here's the thing, is dissatisfaction leads to resentment. And there is nothing like a mom who is filled with resentment. It is a tough space to live in for herself and for the people around her. So I think this idea of, being open to the evolution of who we are as people it's real. It's real life. I think one of the things that I try to remind myself of is that there's a season for everything. So there's a season for me when I was changing diapers and running kids to daycare, and that was a different season of my life. And I'm in a different season now where it's like I've got one kid left in high school. I have adult children. What it means to be present and available to them looks very different.
Right.
That when it looked like when they were little. And in some ways I've learned some things about the moments that I missed, and I had to reconcile that, and just as they've gotten older, be able to talk about that. My youngest will always remind me of like, just feeling like I'm always busy, which is true. But one thing that I think we've found balance in is that like she checks my schedule every day.
Wow.
So she pulls my phone out, she looks at my Outlook, and she's like, can you commit to being home at this time?
Wow.
Like your last meeting's at
Wow.
4. Will you be home by 5? And sometimes I get there and sometimes I don't. But I've also learned that like, if I can maintain those commitments on the days that we can agree, and on the days that I can say to her, I don't really know how long that's going to be, but don't be mad at me about it.
Right.
It gives me permission to be the CEO that I need to be, but it also makes me feel like she's not mad at me for being the CEO. Right. So we're trying to find some ways, because she said something to me and I told her we were going to do this podcast. I was like, oh, I have mom guilt all the time and my kids are big. And I was like, do you ever feel like, I miss some things? She's like, oh, I would always like never tell you about things for school because I just knew your schedule, like you couldn't come. And I was like, ouch. Like now she's 16 and now she's telling me that she didn't tell me about things that were available at elementary school to invite your parents to do, because she was just like, I know you didn't have that flexibility. And I was like, well, that's kind of terrible, Maya. Why would you do that? But it was her way of probably feeling like she was trying to help me find balance and knowing that I didn't have a lot of capacity and not as much flexibility then either. So, yeah.
That is, one, that feels painful. And I think, one of the things that shows up for me is just that we have a lot of pain in life. The fact that we can't be 5 people at the same time means that we're going to have these disappointments. That's the natural type of pain. It's not that somebody did something wrong and this pain is here. And we have to figure out how to live with that without kind of abandoning what really matters to us, you know? So it's really interesting to think of like the pain of missing out on, you know, things that we can't make time for because we're working moms versus the pain of, you know, not loving our kids, right? So many people have these stories of parents that were really aggressively abusive, right? So not quite to the point of like the guilt that so often we get triggered with is like, I didn't perfectly do blank. My lunches don't look as cute as the other parents, right?
I didn't cut out sandwiches.
Yeah, right?
Little
And
shapes.
I think that context of like, okay, where's the line here? Like, it's disappointing that I don't have that kind of time and energy. Like, you know, I literally just don't have the energy to do some of those things. I love to cook, and I just can't take 15 more minutes to cut dino shapes. Like,
And I think, like, does it bring you joy? Like, to your point, Carm, to, like, does it serve you well? Like, I'm trying to figure out, like, how do we give ourselves permission to show up, you know, as a mom and really lean into the things that bring us the most joy as
But
a
I
parent?
think a part of the disappointment is that we don't have time for all the things that will bring us
100%.
joy. That's where time is the only actually scarce resource, right? Our love, our values, our intention towards people are not finite resources, but arguably money and certainly time are scarce. And so in those times, being able to say like, okay, like how do I sit with my disappointment that I couldn't do this thing that typically brings me joy, but I just can't fit it in.
Yeah. How does that feel for you, Ashley, when you think about like time? Is that the place where you feel the biggest pinch around mom guilt?
Definitely. Because I feel like you'd need like double the amount of hours in a day to actually do, right, the cleaning. Even though, you know, you're sharing it. I get to share it with a partner.
Yeah.
I'm lucky that way. But it is, and not even just the like time in the day, but also the passage of time, right? Like our kids are 7, 4, and 2. And so I swear the first few years, it's like, I mean, maybe it just keeps going that way, but there's so many different little milestones and ways they change. And when you're not there during the day, like it's just the reality that you're missing out on some of that, you know? And so, yeah, I think it is the passage of time, but then time is almost a commodity.
Yeah. And I wonder too, I know for me, I remember when my girls were younger, I was, you know, working, you know, I had to do this thing in my mind of like, okay, if I missed her first step, that I had to say to myself, when I see it, it'll be the first for me. So it was like that reframe of like, yeah, I might have missed, so if, you know, at the time my husband was working third shift, so maybe he got the benefit of some of those moments, but I would still be able to have my moment.
Right.
It just wouldn't be her, you know, so just recalibrating and reframing that was like a way, I think, for me to ease the disappointment maybe.
Yeah.
Where it's like, okay, I got the phone call or he sent me a picture and I wish I would have been there, but she's going to like splatter, you know, pears somewhere else. And then, you know, like I'm going to get that stuff.
It'll still be precious.
It'll still be precious.
Yeah.
I'm really impressed with how you all are bringing it in word. Like, what can I do for myself and with your partners and everything. But Carm, I wanted to ask you what advice you want to give to leaders who run organizations and they have employees or colleagues who are parents, career parents. How can we make these organizational cultures more parent friendly? Like, what's the solution? Is it just a mindset shift, or is it policy? Is it culture change? Like, what does it mean to kind of blow this apart?
Yeah. I think that mindset shift drives policy shift, because if our attitudes don't change, then, how will we then make our structures and the way we're approaching work change? But I think some of it is related to flexibility. And the pandemic has really brought a lot of this up, that not just wearing multiple hats and the burnout and guilt that comes from that, but just the general mental and emotional fatigue that's then dropping our energy, and now we're tapping into that time energy scarcity situation. And so when we as employees, when we as leaders, depending on which level you're working on, are trying to show up to have a thriving organization, sometimes you have to make choices around like, how do we make space to empower, to stay on point with the mission of what our organization is pursuing at the time? And not to say that things like financial solvency and things like that pale in comparison, though at times I think they should, because there is so much literature about being able to thrive and that being able to create kind of sustained longer term outcomes. And I think at times what that requires of leaders in the mindset shift first is, how do we embrace flexibility, letting go of control, uncertainty? These are life skills that are really hard to do in general and worthwhile for every person to spend time cultivating. That distress tolerance of sitting in uncertainty so that we can respond intentionally rather than reactively in the specific context, in a way that takes our values, our goals, our mission, and then everybody that's involved into account. And that's a really complex thing to be able to do. But really, in many ways, that's what leaders are tasked with, is how do we navigate this complex interaction of things? Because unless you are the leader of a robot task force, right, which some people are, right? They run rooms of machines, right? And that's fine. But if your people are the ones that are driving your product or, you know, the goals you're trying to achieve, your mission, then you can't act inconvenienced by the fact that they are people, right? If you can't automate what they're doing, if that's really what you want, then automate what they're doing, right? If the fact that you have to deal with a human being is like the deal breaker, right? But so often the creativity, fluidity, vibrancy that your humans are bringing to your workforce is a part of what's making your product good. So that, I think, puts leaders in this precarious position. And Vanessa, I'm going to want to hear your thoughts in this. But can we do the distress tolerance work, that mindful stepping back work of saying, how do I partner with my staff, with my workforce, to be able to be flexible in the moment, making decisions, adjusting, responding intentionally, to then solve problems creatively together as they show up? Because problem solving takes that blame addressing off of the individual mom who's now racked with guilt because they're like, I'm supposed to control the whole universe, and puts it back in communal, right? With work as one of the communities that we're partnering in. And so I really think leaders have this opportunity to take a look at themselves and say, do I listen to my staff when they're telling me their needs and their pain? Am I willing to be uncomfortable? Am I willing to respond flexibly, collaboratively, creatively, drawing from what's working at other places, and then use that innovation to drive the product, right? Not to meander in the middle of the wilderness and have our businesses close, right? Our med centers, everything's closing down. But instead saying, what if the best of all of us drives the best? And that's really not a mentality that you come to easily, right? You have to kind of do that on purpose.
Yeah. I think what's fascinating for me, it's been really thinking about authenticity. And if we don't see people as whole, they're not their authentic selves. And we're creating an environment in which we're saying, you're not invited to be your authentic self here. So I'm also, I think, careful that that flexibility doesn't just live at one level of the organization. And how do we do that in a way that feels equitable when there are some roles in the organization that don't have the same kind of flexibility.
Yeah.
So supervisors have to really get creative about what support looks like. Because if you're a frontline person and your physical presence is required to get the job done, it becomes difficult to say, oh, there's a job that requires physical presence, that's a career mom who's part of our team, but we can't offer her that same flexibility. That doesn't feel great, especially when the higher up in the organization you go, that flexibility does exist.
Yeah.
Because of we can do our works in more offsite, more remote ways. I think if that's anything that we learned from COVID, for sure we did. So I think for me, it's about asking the question about equity. What does that look like? And equity, I just had our staff do an exercise around this of like, let's define it, because it's not equal.
Right.
Right.
It is very much that.
It's very not. It is a commitment to fairness. And how do we create fairness? So maybe for a frontline person, fairness is providing flexibility around an appointment and looking for coverage. Maybe fairness is making sure that there are breastfeeding locations throughout nursing spots throughout our building that are accessible to everyone who's on our team. And just I think the biggest thing for me in supporting, and I have some moms on my team who directly report to me who are in that younger stage of having, babies, which we love. It's little things. It's like when they jump up on Zoom, I'm so intentional about saying hi and just affirming the presence of those kiddos in that space, because those moms are usually like, get out of here. So I just try to create relationship and levity of saying, oh my gosh, I'm so happy to see you. Tell me more about what are you doing today, right? And that creates authenticity, because I know that they are not, we're not flat Stanleys. I don't know if you guys remember that book where it's like, he just got mailed everywhere. We're three-dimensional whole people with complicated experiences in the world. And my hope is that I can create space in our team that the team who are right now really raising younger kids can feel supported. I have moms on my team who are nursing and will go camera free, and they're like, mom duty. I'm like, great, got it. But we've created that culture on our team where it's like, even though we have men on our team, that there's no shame in that, right? And there's no like, oh, she's not getting her job done, because we know that they are bringing in their best selves. And if they don't feel guilty about what they have to do to be a mom, then I don't want them to feel guilty to what they have to do to be a leader.
Yeah. I think you're speaking to this really intensely creative problem solving, though, because you're right. There are so many jobs that you have to spend at least a minimum amount of time, a certain amount of time present on the floor, and being able to say, okay, well then what do we do with the rest of your time? Can we be flexible with how you document? Can we be like, let's actually dig in there, not ignore boundaries and limits, right? And not take on guilt about boundaries and limits, but saying, okay, is there a space to be creative here then? Then let's get innovative. Let's get creative. Like, we don't have to end the story at all or nothing. We can get in this kind of super flexible middle, which is hard. That puts more onus on the leaders to do that.
Right. And to know that, like, I know for me, I'm not a big, my team, they love me, I think, sometimes. But, I'm always like, how many more policies? Like, and I'm so much more about, tell me about the practice. What is it that we're trying to put in practice? And does that need a policy? I'm with you. But if it's a practice that we're trying to cultivate, can we lean into the practice? So I'm trying to find balance in that too, because I know that when you have a large staff, there are going to be needs that come up that you just can't meet those needs. And then that doesn't feel great. But if we're really targeting this idea of, we have people in our community of work that are career parents and they need some flexibility, what does that look like? Because I just feel like it's a fair exchange. That flexibility gets me someone who wants to be there, who's willing to go the extra mile for the job, who sees themselves as someone who is cared for, seen and valued, and I think will reciprocate that to the organization. So I feel like it is an investment, but it's one that's going to give you some return.
Yeah.
Can I call out something you said about value? Because I almost feel like even a step before, how do we be creative and how do we, like, you have to value your employees enough that the changes are worth it. And so something I've experienced as a career mom is, it is tough for some coworkers who maybe were stay-at-home parents, right? Who, when their kids were younger, that was not the norm, that moms were working. Dads were working, but moms were not working. Or that there's really a confusion about why would you work? Like, why would you be a mom and have children and work, right? And so there's all these stereotypes and really stigmas and mindsets that if you have that in the workplace, it almost feels like a step before, like, you have to know that your working parents, and specifically your working moms, have value and be willing to make those changes around it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think some of that speaks to women not being valued, though, because generationally I grew up in a family that was like immigrant, very maternal driven. My grandmother, my mother were all, workers. My mom was a single mom for a period of time. And so the mentality that I was raised in, and this I think speaks to the fact that we get our stories from what we're exposed to. So leaders have to navigate the fact that different people are bringing different stories in. Right. And so being able to cultivate the conversations sometimes has to be one-on-one. What's making this difficult for you? Let's partner together. But I think having women in the workplace, having diversity at all in the workplace, whether that's racial diversity, gender diversity, it's like now you can't be cookie cutter and be like, well, this is what you have to do. You have to give everything to here, deal with whatever shows up. And that's just not it anymore. And I think people during the pandemic, I think this has highlighted a lot, but I also think that as social justice movements have happened, we're now seeing people saying, I don't want to live under that anymore. That's contributing to my guilt, my burnout. Like, that's not what I want my life to be about anymore. That's going to be a seed of regret for me.
Yeah. I think what's interesting about, too, what you said, Ashlyn, is almost like you're trying to explain it to the generation that was there before you, right? So it's like you're looking for permission and be like, don't give me a hard time about like this mom guilt thing or the fact that I'm looking to have balance and do all the things, because maybe that wasn't how you showed up in the world at that time. I do think that's just helping set some norms in the organization around that. This has evolved. Right. And we want, we talk about choice so much in this country. And it is about choice. Like, I should have the choice to say, I want to be a mom and a partner and a worker and a learner. And I don't have to not be all those things. I think what I have a responsibility to is to determine how much of that can I do in one season of my life and not have regret about it.
Right.
Right.
And
you know what I mean?
Yeah. I love it.
There may always be some regret because it's not going to be easy and clear all the time. I think there is a little bit of a mentality of what do we do with FOMO, right? What do we do when we have to miss out on something or when something doesn't pan out the way we had expected it to? And so often I think that can be a place of guilt and regret instead of going, wait a second. I'm not a fortune teller. I never would have known this. Right. So how do I just respond to this new information I'm gaining instead of turning it inward and blaming myself and now feeling regret or self-punishment or criticism or things based on that? Because how could you have known, right?
And I think for me, and maybe it's, part of me is there's an internal optimism piece of like, I'm just going to try to find the joy in it. Yeah. I'm going to find the joy in the moments that I have. I'm going to try to find the joy in the decisions that I made. I'll lament when I need to lament. But I feel like I can be my best self when I can find like, what's the one good thing that came out of this? Even if it was a lesson about you did too much in that season and it cost you.
Right.
I'm going to walk away knowing that, there's a way that I have to approach things because I do have a limit. So,
I love that reflection. Can I add one policy?
Yes.
Belabor this conversation, but maternity leave, specifically maternity leave, parental leave in general. But my gut feeling, without having read the study from the sociologist that you referenced, Sarah, is that the fact that still in the United States, we have no paid parental leave for people who have had a baby, and almost every other country does. So in terms of a policy that companies can put into place, paid parental leave. That is not
moms
short term
and dads.
for moms and
Yeah.
dads.
Yeah, we're
Yep.
great.
And it is not short-term disability. Short-term disability is great, but what you're asking your employee to do is to take a pay cut
Yep.
at a time when their medical costs are going up, their living costs are going up, they are probably daycare costs are happening.
absolutely.
And so paid parental leave.
I love
Yeah.
it.
And not
Amen,
say it enough.
amen,
Yes.
amen.
Yes. Thank you.
Ashlyn,
Yes.
thank you for bringing this up as a topic. I'm sure there are people out there that are feeling heard when they hear this
hope so.
episode. I'm grateful for all of you for being part of this movement of helping others in the workplace enhance their individual and collective team performance. Part of that, it's really going to be paid maternity leave, parental leave. Thank you, listeners, for downloading The Behaviorist. We hope that you'll subscribe. You can also reach out to us through our website, workwisdomllc.com, where you can enjoy Work Wisdom press and productions, ask questions, and give suggestions of topics, just like Ashlyn did, that you'd like us to explore in future episodes. As is our custom, we'll leave you with a quote. I had to go with Michelle Obama.
I mean,
She's
go for it.
She's a leader
Michelle
and a
Obama.
mother. She said, "For me, being a mother made me a better professional because coming home every night to my girls reminded me of what I was working for, and being a professional made me a better mother because by pursuing my dream, I was modeling for my girls how to pursue their dreams."
100%,
Love it.
Michelle.
Yeah.
Thank
She
you all.
deserves applause.
Yes.
Thank you.